Hi everyone, welcome to today's episode on Fast Intelligent Care on why recliner fit or recliner size matters when you're doing your recliner chair prescriptions. So in today's episode, we'll go through how your recliner size or your chair size affects your client's posture, how it affects their pressure distribution, as well as their ability to do effective transfers. And then we'll go through how specific dimensions like your seat width, seat height, seat depth, how getting the incorrect dimension in these three dimensions or even your leg rest length can affect the client in terms of pressure, posture, and transferability. So let's first start with why size is important. So if you can imagine a Venn diagram, so imagine you have three circles and it's size, pressure, and posture, and they're all three intersecting. When you think of size, a very easy example to understand is having a chair that's too wide. If you sit in a chair that's too wide, you don't really have the support of your armrests, which means you end up leaning towards one side, and what happens is you're sitting with a poor posture, you're putting more pressure on one side of the body. So let's say you're leaning towards your left side, your left elbow and buttock is going to have increased levels of pressure. So you're not going to have that equal weight distribution where instead of putting pressure on one side, we're having it equally distributed over the buttocks or over both elbows. So size can very much disrupt your posture and your pressure distribution. And if you can imagine doing a transfer. So let's say I'm someone who struggles to stand up from a seated position from a chair, and I actually do need to use my armrest to push off from. If my armrests are too wide and too far away from my body, I don't really have the right support to be able to push off from this armrest because it might be too far and it's going to be a bit more ineffective, or my use of my muscle strength is going to be more ineffective. Or if you can imagine someone who is sitting in a chair that's way too deep or way too high, they're going to have to shuffle forward. They're going to have to adjust their position before they can actually get into a position to be able to do that sit to stand. So let's go into a little bit more detail on seat width, seat height, and seat depth, as well as your leg rest length. So let's first go with seat width. So I already mentioned the scenario where you have the armrest too far away from you. You have the too wide seat. But let's go and think of someone that's sitting in a chair that's too narrow. So this is where you will have your sides, your armrests, your recliner chair sides too close to the person, actually possibly touching their hips and thighs. So that's going to, over time, actually cause pressure injuries, because from research, we do know that it's not just high levels of pressure that cause pressure injuries, but it could also be low levels of pressure over a long period of time. So even though it's just slightly touching the thighs, that could still cause that pressure injury. So we ideally do want to have a little bit of space on both sides of the hips and thighs. And that's why a lot of times with your recliner measurements, you're actually adding onto your measurement. So let's say I am taking a seat width measurement, I'm going to possibly add on an inch to my measurement to actually get the right size or the right seat width dimensions to make sure that when I am sitting in my chair, there is about hand space on both sides so that I'm not sitting up against the armrest sides. So our next dimension is seat height. So if we think of someone that's sitting in a chair that's too high, they're going to have someone that's possibly dangling their feet. Their feet are not going to be supported on the ground, and that means that we're going to have excess pressure on our thighs and buttocks, and that's where we're going to possibly get some pressure injuries. And then if you can imagine someone wanting to actually do a transfer now, we want to have the feet firmly planted on the floor. So they're going to have to kind of shuffle forward or down the chair, like slightly almost sliding down the chair to get their feet on the floor. But now, because they've kind of slid down the chair, they're possibly going to be in this, what we call posterior pelvic tilt posture, where the pelvis is tilted backwards. So you're sitting kind of on your sacrum, so on your tailbone. So a lot of people call it like a slouched position or sacral sitting position. And that's going to cause excess pressure on your sitting bones, your ITs or ischial tuberosities, excess pressure on your thighs because you're now kind of sitting on the edge with your thighs sitting on the edge of your chair. And you're also going to have excess pressure on the sacrum, which we already know is a very vulnerable area for pressure injuries because it is that bony prominence with there's not really padding there. So we don't want to have that excess pressure on the sacrum or the tailbone. And then with that posterior pelvic tilt posture, it might even have the person with their head more tilted down, and that's not ideal for interaction, for swallowing, for engagement with your environment, for your vision, especially because your visual field is kind of reduced to the floor. So we don't want to have a chair that's too high. But then if we have a chair that's too low, you're going to have someone with their knees up a lot higher. And because of that, we actually don't have contact with the person's thighs on the chair by the front, I guess just behind the back of the knee, by the front of the thighs. So more pressure towards the back of the thighs and towards the sacral area or buttocks. And again, that excess pressure on the very vulnerable sacral area by the sacrum or tailbone. And then when we look at someone that actually needs to stand up from a very low seat, even if you are using a chair that helps lift you up, you're not going to have as much increase in your height if you're sitting on a too low chair. And that means you're going to need more strength to stand up. So your legs are going to require a lot more effort to be able to stand up from that low position. And we know when you're standing up from bed or you're standing up from a chair, we want to have the chair go a little bit higher to assist the person, especially if we have someone that has difficulty with mobility or difficulty of strength. You don't want them to struggle to stand up. So that too low seat does affect your transferability as well. So our next dimension that we'll look at is our seat depth. So we could have either a too deep or a too shallow seat depth. So let's first imagine someone in a chair that's too deep. Naturally, you're going to want to have your feet on the floor because that's what stabilizes you. That's what helps you to keep a seated posture, because if your feet aren't on the floor, your legs are dangling and you get fatigued and you get uncomfortable and you can't maintain an upright posture. So something that can happen is someone's either going to sit to the very back of the chair, but then their feet dangle and they have, again, excess pressure underneath their thighs. But most of the time, what's going to happen is they're going to actually have their feet on the floor. They're going to sit towards the front edge of the chair, and then they have this gap at the back behind them. So behind the person's buttocks and back and the backrest of the chair. And we get fatigued with, sitting upright without a backrest. So we do end up leaning backwards towards our backrest, but because we're now sitting a lot more forward on the chair, we get that posterior pelvic tilt posture where our pelvis is tilted backwards and we're sitting on our sacrum and we're adding extra pressure to the sacral area or to the buttocks. And now you can imagine someone with that posterior pelvic tilt posture, we're actually squashing this area just so underneath our rib cage and between our rib cage and our pelvis. It's this area that has a lot of essential organs that are in that area. And if we're sitting in this kind of slouched posture, we're squashing that area and we're affecting our digestion, our breathing, our circulation, very important physiological functions because we're sitting in a poor posture. Now, we can also look at someone with a too shallow seat depth. So that means very short seat depth where the person's actually not fully supported on the seat. So there isn't a section of their legs that isn't actually on a seat base. So this could also cause increased pressure because we're not spreading the load over that larger area. And that's what pressure distribution is having as much of your chair or your support surface or your bed in contact with the person's body and with their skin, so that we're spreading the pressure over a larger area. So having that person really just sitting on like a small section of a seat and having their legs not fully supported on that seat, they're going to have excess pressure on the back of the thigh and the buttocks. So we're almost in all of these scenarios increasing pressure by those vulnerable areas, which is our tailbone or our sacrum. So now that we've looked at seat width, seat height, seat depth, we also look at things like your leg rest length. So with your leg rest length, we do get a lot of cases where clients actually believe that their legs have to be fully supported on their leg rest. But something that we do need to understand is that our heels are very vulnerable. Our heels have a very small surface area and not a lot of padding. So it doesn't take that long to develop a pressure injury on the heels, which is why our heels are one of those very vulnerable areas, same as your sacrum or tailbone, that do typically get pressure injuries. So we actually want to have the heels off of our leg rest, but there is a point where our feet are too far off the leg rest. So if you can imagine someone with their legs elevated, so they're sitting in their recliner, legs are elevated by their leg rest, and you have the heels on top of the leg rest. Now, a lot of pressure going through the heel, very small surface area, and not a lot of pressure going over our calf. But if you can think of size, our calf is a lot bigger surface area. So we'd rather have our calves on our leg rest. So that's where we want to shift a little bit further down and actually have heels off of the leg rest, heels completely offloaded, and our calves on the leg rest. But go too far and you actually have your feet drop. So you're not going to have that naturally upright position of your feet. Your feet are going to go in this kind of plantar flexed foot drop posture where your feet are kind of turned down. This is also causing pressure on your Achilles tendon, which we don't want. We want to have our feet stay upright, be naturally supported in that upright posture. We don't want to have the risk of someone getting a contracture in their feet. So your clients that are bed-bound and spend a lot of time in bed, they do tend to get that plantar flexed contracture because their feet are turned downwards. So even when you're lying in bed, you actually want to have something supporting the feet to stay upright. So sometimes that's a pillow. So having the right length leg rest is very important. And that's something that is going to be important to be adjustable. So having that adjustability does help a lot, especially if you have someone that has those unique body proportions. Or even if you think of someone that's very slender, but very tall. You're not going to just go for a big chair because they're tall, because they're then going to have a too wide seat. So modular chairs, recliner chairs are really good to have because you can really adjust the chair for the person's specific body proportions. And if you can think of someone that is still growing, even better, because the chair is going to be able to grow with that person if you can adjust the chair. Now, important that different seating surfaces or seating systems are going to require different measurements. So when you're looking at a recliner chair prescription, your way of doing measurements are going to be different for your wheelchairs. So always take that into account. Recliner chairs aren't going to be exactly the same as your wheelchairs, especially when you're looking at your seat depth measurement. Because with your wheelchairs, you don't want to go into the back of the knee, whereas with your recliner chairs, we actually do take that measurement from the back of the knee. So very important to take that into account. Always check the specific chair that you're prescribing if there is specific measurement guidelines for that seating system. Thank you for joining today's episode. And let us know if you have any seating measurement tips. We'd love to hear from you.